The late afternoon sun filtered through the curtains of the modest Carter family home. Clara sat on the edge of her bed, clutching the embossed wedding invitation in her trembling hands. The gold lettering gleamed mockingly against the pale pink cardstock. It read, "The wedding of Ethan Montgomery and Clara Carter." Her mother, Sarah, entered the room quietly, holding a basket of folded laundry. "Clara, are you sure about this?" she asked, her voice a mix of pride and apprehension. "The Montgomerys, they're not like us." Clara sighed, running her fingers over the expensive paper. "Mom, Ethan loves me. He doesn't care about the differences between our families." Sarah nodded, but her face betrayed her doubt. "Love is one thing, sweetheart, but their world, it's cutthroat. Have you seen how they look at us?" Clara didn't respond immediately. She had seen it, the scornful gazes, the thinly veiled disdain when she visited the Montgomery estate. But Ethan's assurances always pulled her back from the edge of doubt. Before she could speak, her father, Thomas, walked into the room, the lines of his face etched deeper than usual. His work boots left faint traces of mud on the floor as he set down his weathered cap on the table. His expression was grim. "What's wrong, Dad?" Clara asked, alarmed by the tension in his posture. Thomas avoided her gaze. "Today at work, Andrew Montgomery called me to his office," he said, his voice heavy. "He told me if this wedding goes forward, I'll lose my job." Clara's heart sank. "He can't do that," she exclaimed, anger flaring in her chest. Thomas looked at her sadly. "He's a powerful man, Clara. He can do whatever he wants." The room fell silent. Sarah reached for her husband's hand, her expression one of determination. "We'll figure something out. We always do." But Clara could barely hear her mother's words. Her mind swirled with the weight of the divide between her family and Ethan's, a chasm that seemed impossible to bridge. Meanwhile, across town at the sprawling Montgomery estate, Ethan paced the length of his father's study. The rich scent of mahogany filled the air, but it did little to calm his nerves. His parents, Andrew and Victoria Montgomery, sat opposite him, their expressions stony. "This is madness," Andrew said, slamming his hand on the armrest of his leather chair. "You're throwing away everything we've built for some girl who doesn't even belong in our world." Ethan stopped pacing and turned to face them, his green eyes blazing. "I love her. She's not just some girl. Clara makes me feel alive, like I can be myself." Victoria let out a sharp laugh. "And what happens when the novelty wears off? When you're faced with the reality of what it means to marry beneath your station?" Ethan clenched his fists, his voice trembling with controlled fury. "If necessary, I'll work in a factory or a field, just like Clara's father. At least I'll be happy and honest." Andrew rose to his feet, towering over his son. "You're an ungrateful fool. If you go through with this, you'll lose your inheritance, your name, everything." Ethan met his father's glare without flinching. "Then I'll lose it. I'd rather have nothing with Clara than everything with your approval." Victoria stood as well, her voice icy. "You're making the biggest mistake of your life." Ethan turned his back on them, heading for the door. "The biggest mistake would be not fighting for the person I love." As the door slammed shut behind him, Andrew sank back into his chair, his jaw tight with fury. "This wedding isn't going to happen," he said, his tone dangerous. "Not if I can help it." Victoria nodded. "We need to find another way." Clara stared at the wedding invitation once more, her fingers trembling. "I can't let Ethan destroy his future for me," she murmured. But deep down she knew their love was worth fighting for, even if it meant standing against the full force of the Montgomery family. The faint hum of the coffee pot filled the Carter family kitchen as Clara sat at the small wooden table, her hands cradling a mug. The warmth did little to ease the cold knot of fear in her chest. Across from her, Thomas Carter stirred his coffee absently, his gaze fixed on the swirling liquid as though it held the answers to his problems. "I should have said something sooner," Thomas began, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I hoped he'd reconsider. I thought—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "Dad, this isn't your fault," Clara interjected, though her voice wavered. "Andrew Montgomery thinks he can bully anyone who doesn't fit into his world." Thomas sighed heavily. "It's not just a threat, Clara. If he fires me, I don't know how we'll make ends meet. Your mom and I worked hard to keep this house and—" His words faded as the enormity of the situation settled over them. Clara's throat tightened. She glanced out the window where her mother was tending to the small garden. The sight of Sarah's careworn hands pruning flowers reminded her of everything they stood to lose. "I'll talk to Ethan," Clara said, determination flickering in her voice. "We'll find a way." Ethan Montgomery was in his apartment, pacing furiously. He had left the family mansion hours earlier, his father's words ringing in his ears. His phone buzzed and he snatched it up, hoping for Clara. It was his mother instead. "We need to talk," Victoria said, her tone sharp. "There's nothing left to say," Ethan snapped. "You and Dad have made your position perfectly clear." Her laugh was cold. "Oh, Ethan, don't be so naive. This isn't about love, it's about survival. You think Clara can handle what comes with being part of this family? The scrutiny? The judgment?" "She's stronger than you give her credit for," Ethan replied. "She's not one of us," Victoria retorted. "And you're fooling yourself if you think love is enough to bridge that gap." Ethan hung up, his jaw tight with frustration. He looked at the photo of Clara on his desk, her warm smile, her steady gaze. It was a stark contrast to the icy veneer of his family. He dialed her number. "Ethan," Clara answered, her voice hesitant. "I need to see you," he said. "Now." Later that evening, Clara met Ethan at a small park near her home. The fading sunlight painted the sky in hues of orange and gold. Clara could see the tension etched into Ethan's face as he approached. "Ethan, we need to talk about your father," she began, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. He nodded grimly. "I know. You told me what he said to your dad. I can't believe he'd stoop so low." Clara's expression softened. "He's trying to protect his family's reputation. I don't agree with it, but I understand why he's doing this." Ethan stopped walking, turning to face her. "You're defending him?" "No," she said quickly. I don't want you to lose everything because of me." He stepped closer, his hands finding hers. "Clara, I'd lose everything 100 times over if it meant being with you." She looked away, doubt flickering in her eyes. "But what about your family? Your future?" Ethan's voice was firm. "My future is with you. Not with my father's money or his approval." Tears welled in Clara's eyes. "Ethan, I love you, but this is tearing my family apart. My dad, he's worked so hard. I can't let your father destroy everything they've built." Ethan pulled her into a tight embrace, his voice soft but resolute. "We'll figure this out, Clara. Together." Back at the Montgomery estate, Andrew sat in his study, swirling a glass of whiskey as Victoria paced the room. "You're too soft on him," she said sharply. "Ethan's digging a hole for himself and you're letting him." Andrew set his glass down, his expression unreadable. "Don't mistake patience for inaction. If Ethan won't listen, then we'll escalate." Victoria arched an eyebrow. "What do you have in mind?" He smirked. "Let's just say I have a way of ensuring this wedding never happens." The next morning, Clara awoke to find her father at the kitchen table again, staring at a letter. "What is it?" she asked, her stomach sinking. "It's from the estate," Thomas said, his voice flat. "They've terminated my employment. Effective immediately." Clara's blood ran cold. She clenched her fists, anger bubbling to the surface. "They can't do this. It's illegal." Thomas shook his head. "They can do whatever they want, Clara. They're the Montgomerys." Clara stormed out of the house, dialing Ethan as she walked. He answered on the second ring. "They fired him, Ethan. They fired my dad." There was a pause before Ethan spoke, his voice heavy with guilt. "I'm coming over." Ethan arrived at the Carter home within the hour. He sat across from Thomas and Sarah, his expression one of deep remorse. "This is my father's doing," he said. "And I'll make it right." Thomas looked at him, his face stern but not unkind. "Ethan, I don't blame you for this. But I don't want my family dragged through the mud because of a fight with your father." Ethan's jaw tightened. "I'll talk to him. He doesn't get to decide our future." Clara placed a hand on his arm. "Ethan, you can't fight him alone." He met her gaze, his voice steady. "I'm not alone. I have you." Ethan leaned against the railing of his apartment balcony, staring out at the cityscape. The skyline glittered in the fading evening light, but its usual allure was lost on him. His mind churned with thoughts of his father's ultimatum and the pain it had caused Clara's family. He gripped the cool metal of the railing until his knuckles turned white, frustration boiling in his chest. Memories of Clara played in his mind, vivid and full of life. He thought back to their first meeting at a local animal shelter, where she volunteered her weekends. Her genuine smile as she cared for the stray dogs had caught him off guard, piercing through his jaded outlook on life. "You really care about these animals," he had said, leaning against the doorframe of the shelter's small office. Clara had looked up, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Someone has to. They've been abandoned and they deserve love just like anyone else." Her words had stayed with him, echoing in his mind whenever he questioned the chaos of his privileged existence. She had been unlike anyone he had ever known, kind, selfless, and unafraid to speak her mind. And now, because of him, her family was suffering. Meanwhile, Clara sat on the floor of her childhood bedroom, surrounded by the soft glow of fairy lights. She held an old photo album on her lap, flipping through its pages. Pictures of family vacations, birthdays, and holidays filled the pages, each one a testament to the life her parents had worked so hard to build. Her phone buzzed beside her, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from Ethan. "I love you. I'm with you. Always." Her heart clenched. She wanted to believe him, to trust that their love was strong enough to withstand the Montgomerys' cruelty. But doubt lingered, an unrelenting whisper in the back of her mind. Her mother's voice broke through her reverie. "Clara, sweetheart, dinner's ready." Clara closed the album and stood, forcing a smile as she joined her parents at the table. They sat in heavy silence, the weight of the day's events pressing down on them. Finally, Thomas spoke. "Clara, I know you love Ethan. But are you sure this is worth it?" Her fork paused halfway to her mouth. "What do you mean?" Thomas looked at her, his eyes filled with worry. "His family has already shown what they're willing to do to protect their image. If you marry him, they'll never stop trying to tear us apart." Clara set her fork down, her appetite gone. "Dad, Ethan isn't like them. He loves me." Sarah reached across the table to squeeze her hand. "We know, sweetheart. But love isn't always enough to fight people like the Montgomerys." Clara looked down, the words stinging more than she wanted to admit. "I won't let them win," she whispered, more to herself than to her parents. The next morning, Ethan arrived at the Carter home with a determined expression. Clara met him on the front porch, crossing her arms as she looked up at him. "We need to talk," she said. "I know," he replied, stepping closer. "But first, I need you to hear me out." Clara nodded, and they sat on the porch swing, the soft creak of the chains filling the silence between them. "I've been thinking a lot about us," Ethan began, his voice steady but full of emotion. "And about what my family is trying to do to keep us apart. I hate what they've done to your dad, to your family. And I swear, Clara, I'm going to fix it." "How?" she asked, her tone sharper than she intended. "How can you fix this, Ethan? Your father fired my dad. He threatened my family." Ethan reached for her hand, his touch gentle. "By standing up to him. By proving that I'm not like him. I'm not going to let him ruin what we have." Clara searched his face, looking for any hint of doubt. But all she saw was resolve. "Ethan, I believe you. I do. But this isn't just about us anymore. My family, they're paying the price for something they didn't ask for. And that's exactly why I won't let him win," Ethan said, his grip on her hand tightening. "Clara, you're my future. You're my family now. And I'll do whatever it takes to protect you." Tears welled in her eyes, but she quickly blinked them away. "I don't want to lose you," she admitted, her voice breaking. "You won't," Ethan promised, pulling her into his arms. "We're in this together." As the sun set over the Montgomery estate, Andrew sat in his study, poring over documents that detailed his family's wealth and influence. His wife, Victoria, entered the room, her heels clicking against the polished floor. "How's our boy?" she asked, her tone clipped. "Defiant as ever," Andrew replied, not looking up. Victoria sank into the chair opposite him, crossing her legs. "And what are we going to do about it?" Andrew finally looked at her, his expression dark. "Whatever it takes to stop this wedding." The Carter home was a flurry of activity as Clara and her family worked tirelessly to prepare for the wedding. Though the Montgomery family had offered to handle the arrangements, Clara insisted on involving her parents, knowing how much it meant to them. She wanted their love and care woven into every detail of the day, even if it meant enduring the Montgomerys' disapproving glares. Clara sat at the dining table, her fingers stained with glue as she assembled homemade wedding favors. Her best friend, Emma, sat beside her, expertly tying ribbons onto each one. "You know, most brides just order these things online," Emma teased, flashing a grin. Clara smiled faintly. "I wanted something personal. Something that feels real." Emma glanced at her friend, noticing the exhaustion etched into her face. "You okay, Clara?" Clara hesitated before nodding. "Just tired. The Montgomerys aren't exactly making this easy." Emma scoffed. "I don't know how you put up with them. If I had to spend 5 minutes with Victoria Montgomery, I'd lose my mind." Clara laughed softly. "It's not easy, but Ethan makes it worth it." Emma reached over, giving Clara's hand a reassuring squeeze. "You've got this. Don't let them get to you." At the Montgomery estate, the atmosphere was far less cheerful. Victoria paced the grand living room, her sharp heels clicking against the marble floor. Andrew watched her from his armchair, sipping a glass of scotch. She's turning our son into a stranger, Victoria said, her tone venomous. Did you see the guest list? Half the people are from her side, and they're barely above common laborers. Andrew set his glass down, his expression unreadable. I've made it clear to Ethan where we stand. If he insists on going through with this, he'll have to face the consequences. Victoria's eyes narrowed. It's not enough. We need to show him the cost of his choices before it's too late. Andrew leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing on his lips. Leave that to me. Clara arrived at the boutique for her final dress fitting, her mother and Emma in tow. The sight of her wedding dress hanging on the rack brought tears to Sarah's eyes. Oh, Clara, Sarah whispered. You're going to look so beautiful. Clara smiled, stepping into the dressing room. As the seamstress helped her into the gown, she caught a glimpse of herself in the mirror. The dress was simple but elegant, its flowing silhouette a reflection of her personality. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine walking down the aisle toward Ethan, their love triumphing over everything. But the moment was interrupted when the boutique door swung open, and Victoria Montgomery swept in like a storm. Her eyes landed on Clara, and her lips curved into a thin smile. Clara darling, Victoria said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. I thought I'd stop by to see how the preparations are coming along. Clara's stomach tightened. Everything is going well, Mrs. Montgomery. Thank you for asking. Victoria's gaze drifted to the dress, her expression cool. It's quaint, but I suppose it suits you. Sarah stepped forward, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Clara looks stunning. She'll make Ethan proud. Victoria's smile didn't reach her eyes. Let's hope so. After all, the Montgomery name carries a certain level of expectation. Clara bit back a retort, unwilling to let Victoria provoke her. Instead, she turned back to the seamstress and said, I think we're done here. As they left the boutique, Clara felt the weight of Victoria's words pressing down on her. She knew the Montgomery matriarch would never accept her, but she refused to let that overshadow her love for Ethan. The days leading up to the wedding were a blur of last-minute arrangements and rising tension. The Montgomerys insisted on holding a lavish rehearsal dinner at their estate, and Clara reluctantly agreed, knowing it was a battle she couldn't win. The night of the dinner, Clara arrived with her parents, their modest attire a stark contrast to the opulent surroundings. The Montgomery estate glittered with crystal chandeliers and ornate decorations, every detail designed to flaunt the family's wealth. Clara felt the stares as she entered the grand dining hall, her hand clasped tightly in Ethan's. The Montgomery guests whispered behind their hands, their disapproval palpable. Victoria greeted them with a tight smile. Clara, Thomas, Sarah. Welcome. Thank you, Mrs. Montgomery, Clara replied, her tone polite but distant. As the dinner progressed, the tension only grew. Andrew made pointed remarks about the importance of legacy, while Victoria subtly criticized every aspect of the wedding that Clara's family had contributed to. Clara held her head high, refusing to let their barbs break her. But when Andrew turned his attention to Thomas, the evening took a darker turn. Thomas, Andrew said, swirling his wine. I hear you've been unemployed since leaving the estate. That must be difficult. Thomas set down his fork, his expression calm but firm. It's been an adjustment, but we're managing. Andrew smirked. I'm sure you are. It must be comforting to know your daughter will be marrying into a family that can provide for her. Clara's cheeks flushed with anger, but before she could respond, Ethan spoke up. That's enough, Dad, he said, his voice cold. Clara and her family have more integrity than you could ever understand. The room fell silent, all eyes on Ethan. Andrew's smirk faltered, but he quickly recovered, raising his glass in mock deference. To integrity then. As the dinner ended, Clara felt a mixture of relief and exhaustion. She knew the Montgomerys wouldn't give up their fight, but she also knew she had Ethan by her side, and together they could face anything. The morning of the wedding dawned beneath a slate-gray sky, as if the heavens themselves were bracing for the storm to come. Clara sat in her small bedroom, staring at her reflection in the mirror. Her simple white dress hung perfectly, the fabric hugging her in all the right places. She looked beautiful, but her heart was a tangle of nerves. Her mother, Sarah, bustled into the room carrying a steaming cup of tea. Drink this, sweetheart, she said gently, setting the cup down. It'll calm your nerves. Clara turned to her mother, tears welling in her eyes. Mom, what if this doesn't work? What if Ethan's family never accepts me? Sarah knelt in front of her, taking her hands. Listen to me, Clara. This day is about you and Ethan, not them. If you love each other, nothing else matters. Clara nodded, her resolve strengthening. She wouldn't let the Montgomerys ruin this day, not for her and not for Ethan. At the Montgomery estate, the atmosphere was tense. Ethan adjusted his cufflinks in front of the gilded mirror, his jaw tight. His best man Ben stood nearby, watching him with a mix of concern and amusement. "You look like you're gearing up for battle, not a wedding," Ben joked, trying to lighten the mood. Ethan shot him a dry look. "It feels like both." Ben clapped him on the shoulder. "Well, you've got this. Clara's worth it." Ethan nodded, his expression softening at the thought of her. "She's worth everything." The small village church filled quickly as guests from two vastly different worlds took their seats. On one side, the Montgomery family and their high society friends sat stiffly, their designer outfits and haughty expressions making it clear they didn't belong in such modest surroundings. On the other side, the Carter family and their neighbors chatted warmly, their laughter and easy camaraderie filling the room with life. Clara waited in the small anteroom at the back of the church, her hands trembling as she clutched her bouquet. Her father, Thomas, entered, his face a mixture of pride and apprehension. "You ready, sweetheart?" he asked, his voice steady. Clara took a deep breath and nodded. "As ready as I'll ever be." Thomas offered his arm, and together they stepped into the aisle as the first notes of the wedding march filled the air. All eyes turned to Clara, and the whispers began immediately. "She looks lovely," someone from the Carter side murmured. "Lovely for a laborer's daughter," someone from the Montgomery side sneered. Clara focused on Ethan, standing at the altar. His face lit up when he saw her, his love and admiration breaking through the tension in the room. It gave her the courage to keep walking. When she reached the altar, Ethan took her hands in his touch grounding her. "You look beautiful," he whispered. "So do you," she whispered back. The priest began the ceremony, his voice calm and steady. But just as the vows were about to be exchanged, the church doors burst open with a loud crash. The congregation gasped and turned to see who had entered. A man stood in the doorway, his face flushed and his expression wild. Clara recognized him as Martin Davies, a former employee of the Montgomery estate. He strode down the aisle, his voice booming. "Stop this wedding," he shouted. The room erupted into chaos. Guests murmured in confusion, and Andrew Montgomery stood abruptly, his face pale. "Get this man out of here," he bellowed. Martin ignored him, pulling a crumpled envelope from his pocket. "I have proof that Andrew Montgomery is a criminal. Fraud, embezzlement, even bribery. It's all here." Ethan froze, his hands tightening around Clara's. "What's he talking about, Dad?" he demanded, his voice shaking. Andrew's face twisted with rage. "He's lying. He's a disgruntled former employee trying to ruin this day." Martin turned to the crowd, his voice rising. "I worked for the Montgomerys for years. I saw everything, the shady deals, the fake accounts. Andrew Montgomery built his empire on lies, and it's time everyone knew the truth." The church fell into stunned silence. Ethan stared at his father, betrayal etched into his features. "Is it true?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Andrew didn't answer, his silence speaking volumes. Ethan turned back to Clara, his face a mask of pain. "I need to know the truth," he said, stepping away from her and toward Martin. Martin handed him the envelope, and Ethan scanned its contents. His hands trembled as he read the damning evidence, his face growing paler with each page. "My God," he muttered. "It's all true." Andrew lunged forward, trying to snatch the papers. "This is nonsense," he shouted. "You can't trust him." But Ethan stepped back, holding the papers out of reach. He turned to the congregation, his voice strong and clear. "My father has lied to all of us. This wedding isn't just about love, it's about breaking free from the corruption that's poisoned our family for years." The guests erupted into chaos, some shouting, others storming out. Clara stood frozen, her heart breaking as she watched Ethan confront his father. "I won't be part of this anymore," Ethan said, his voice trembling with emotion. "Not the lies, not the manipulation. I'm done." He turned to Clara, his eyes filled with pain. "I need time," he said softly. "I need to figure out how to fix this." Clara nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I understand." As Ethan walked out of the church, the weight of his family's sins pressing down on him, Clara felt her world shatter. This was supposed to be their day, but it had become the beginning of a battle far greater than either of them had anticipated. The Montgomery family's estate was eerily quiet as Andrew Montgomery sat alone in his expansive study, the faint ticking of an antique clock the only sound in the room. Papers littered his desk, documents Martin Davies had handed over to Ethan at the wedding. Each one was a nail in the coffin of his carefully constructed empire. In the church earlier that day, Andrew had felt his control slipping away. Now, as he reread the accusations against him, fraud, bribery, tax evasion, his chest tightened. He knew these weren't baseless claims. They were truths that he had spent years and fortunes concealing. And now they had been laid bare in front of the world, starting with his own son. At the Carter home, the aftermath of the wedding unfolded in hushed voices and silent tears. Clara sat at the dining table, still in her wedding dress, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Her mother, Sarah, poured her a cup of tea, though neither of them spoke. Across the room, Thomas stared out the window, his shoulders slumped. "He left," Clara finally whispered, her voice breaking. "He just walked out." Sarah sat beside her daughter, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "He didn't leave you, Clara," she said gently. "He left his family, the lies, the corruption. That's not the same." Clara looked up, her eyes filled with uncertainty. What if it is? What if he can't come back from this? What if he doesn't want to? Thomas turned from the window, his voice steady but firm. "That boy loves you, Clara. That much is clear. He's just lost right now. You need to give him time to find his way back." Clara nodded, though the ache in her chest refused to subside. She thought of Ethan's face as he read the damning evidence against his father, the pain, the betrayal. She could only hope that his love for her would be enough to bring him back. Ethan drove aimlessly through the city, the envelope of evidence resting on the passenger seat. His mind was a whirlwind of anger, shame, and guilt. He had always known his father was ruthless in business, but he had never imagined the depth of his corruption. Fraud, bribery, embezzlement. It was as if every cornerstone of the Montgomery empire was built on lies. His phone buzzed, breaking his spiraling thoughts. It was Ben. "Ethan, where are you?" Ben asked, concern lacing his voice. "I don't know," Ethan admitted. I couldn't stay there. I get it, man. That was a lot. But listen, you can't just disappear. Clara's probably worried sick about you." Ethan clenched the steering wheel, his jaw tightening. "I couldn't face her, not after what my father did to her family." Ben sighed. "Look, you're not responsible for your father's actions. Clara loves you. She doesn't care about your family's name or wealth. She cares about you. Don't lose sight of that." Ethan nodded, though Ben couldn't see it. "Thanks, Ben. I need to figure out how to fix this." "You will," Ben said confidently. "And when you're ready, Clara will be waiting." At the Montgomery estate, Andrew's attempts to control the fallout began. He called in favors, pressured allies, and even threatened a few former associates to keep the scandal contained. But the cracks in his empire were widening, and the once loyal connections he had built were beginning to falter. Victoria entered the study, her composure cracking for the first time. "Andrew, this is a disaster. Our reputation, our legacy, it's all falling apart." Andrew shot her a glare, his voice sharp. "It's under control." "Under control?" Victoria spat. "Your own son walked out of the wedding. Do you have any idea how this looks to our peers? To our business partners?" Andrew stood, his towering frame imposing. "I don't care how it looks, Victoria. What matters is stopping this before it gets worse." Victoria's voice softened, a rare flicker of vulnerability in her tone. "And what about Ethan? You've already pushed him away. How much more are you willing to lose?" Andrew didn't answer, his jaw tightening as he turned back to the damning papers on his desk. Later that evening, Clara sat on her bed, the room dimly lit by her bedside lamp. Her phone sat in her lap, her fingers hovering over Ethan's name in her contacts. She wanted to call him, to tell him she understood, to tell him she was still here. But fear held her back. Finally, her phone buzzed with an incoming text. It was from Ethan. "I'm sorry. I'll fix this. I love you." Tears streamed down her face as she read the words. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep her hope alive. The next morning, Ethan arrived at a lawyer's office downtown, the envelope of evidence clutched tightly in his hand. He had made his decision. If he wanted to break free from his father's shadow, he needed to expose the truth, even if it meant testifying against his own family. The lawyer, a no-nonsense woman named Julia Hayes, looked over the documents with a critical eye. "This is damning," she said finally, setting the papers down. "If you testify, it'll bring your father's entire empire crashing down." Ethan nodded, his resolve firm. "It's the right thing to do." Julia leaned back in her chair, studying him. "You realize this will make you a target, right? Your father won't go down without a fight." "I don't care," Ethan said, his voice steady. "I'm done living a lie." Julia nodded, a flicker of respect in her expression. "All right. Let's get to work." As Ethan left the lawyer's office, he felt a strange sense of relief. For the first time in his life, he was stepping out from under his father's shadow. It wouldn't be easy, but it was the only way forward. His thoughts turned to Clara. He knew he had hurt her by walking out of the wedding, but he also knew that what he was doing now was for her, for them. He pulled out his phone and dialed her number. "Ethan," she answered, her voice soft. "I'm sorry," he said immediately. "For everything." "I know," she replied, her voice trembling. "Are you okay?" "I will be," he said. "I'm going to make this right, Clara. I promise." The courtroom was silent as Ethan sat at the witness stand, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. His lawyer, Julia Hayes, stood beside him, her posture straight and commanding. Across the room sat Andrew Montgomery, his expression cold and unyielding, though the tension in his jaw betrayed his fury. Victoria was at his side, her face pale and rigid, a picture of defiance in the face of scandal. Clara sat in the back row, her presence a quiet reassurance. She had wanted to be there, despite Ethan's insistence that she didn't have to witness the ugliness of his testimony. Her gaze never left him, silently willing him strength. The prosecutor cleared his throat and addressed Ethan. "Mr. Montgomery, let's begin. Can you confirm that the documents presented to the court, detailing fraudulent financial dealings and illegal bribes, are authentic?" Ethan took a deep breath, his voice steady. "Yes, they're authentic." A murmur rippled through the courtroom as the prosecutor continued. "And can you tell us who was responsible for these activities?" Ethan's eyes flickered toward his father, who stared back at him with a venomous glare. "My father, Andrew Montgomery," he said, his voice clear. Andrew's jaw clenched, but he remained silent. The weight of Ethan's words hung heavy in the room, the finality of his betrayal sinking in. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed like vultures, cameras flashing as Ethan exited the building. Clara was waiting for him, standing to the side with her parents. He spotted her immediately, her face a mixture of worry and pride. "Ethan," a reporter shouted, thrusting a microphone toward him. "How does it feel to testify against your own father?" Ethan ignored the question, his focus solely on Clara. He reached her side, his hand finding hers as the reporters pressed closer. "Let's go," he said softly, shielding her from the chaos. As they walked away, Clara squeezed his hand. "You were brave today," she said. "I know how hard that was." Ethan shook his head. "It wasn't just for me. It was for us, for the future we want to build." Back at the Montgomery estate, the fallout was immediate. Andrew's empire, once seemingly untouchable, began to crumble as evidence of his crimes surfaced. Former allies distanced themselves, while the media painted him as the epitome of corporate greed. Victoria confronted Ethan that evening, her composure finally cracking. "How could you do this to us?" she demanded, her voice shaking with anger. Ethan stood his ground. "I did what was right. Something you and Dad seem to have forgotten." Victoria's eyes filled with tears, though her voice remained sharp. "You think you're some kind of hero? All you've done is destroy this family." "This family was already broken," Ethan shot back. "I'm just trying to build something better." For Clara, the days following Ethan's testimony were bittersweet. She was proud of him for standing up to his father, but the backlash was fierce. The Montgomery name, once a symbol of power, had become a lightning rod for scandal. Even Clara's family faced whispers and judgment from those who disapproved of Ethan's actions. One evening, Clara sat with her parents at their kitchen table, the three of them sharing a quiet meal. "How are you holding up?" Sarah asked, her eyes full of concern. Clara shrugged, pushing her food around her plate. "I'm okay. It's just a lot." Thomas reached across the table to take her hand. "You're stronger than you think, Clara. And Ethan, he's fighting for you. That means something." Clara nodded, though the weight of everything still pressed heavily on her. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she also knew that she and Ethan were in it together. The next time Ethan visited Clara's home, he looked more tired than she had ever seen him. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his shoulders were slumped with exhaustion. But when he saw her, a small smile broke through the fatigue. "Hey," he said, stepping into the living room. Clara hugged him tightly, holding him for a long moment before pulling back to study his face. "How are you?" "I'm managing," he said. "Dad's furious, of course. He's fighting every charge, but it's not looking good for him." "And you?" Clara asked softly. "How are you holding up?" Ethan hesitated before answering. "It's hard, Clara. I won't lie. But knowing you're here, it helps." They sat together on the couch, the quiet of the room a stark contrast to the chaos of their lives. Ethan took her hand, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "I don't know what's going to happen next," he admitted. "But I know I want you by my side." Clara smiled, her heart swelling with love and determination. I'm not going anywhere, Ethan. We'll face it together. In the following weeks, the case against Andrew Montgomery gained traction. More witnesses came forward, corroborating Ethan's testimony and painting a damning picture of his father's misdeeds. The media dubbed Ethan a whistleblower, hailing his courage in standing against corruption. But for Ethan, the praise felt hollow. He wasn't seeking accolades, he was seeking redemption. And every step he took away from his father's shadow was a step closer to the life he wanted to build with Clara. One evening, as they sat together in Clara's backyard, Ethan turned to her, his expression serious. I've been thinking about what's next, he said. For us. Clara tilted her head, curiosity lighting her eyes. What do you mean? I want to leave it all behind, he said. The Montgomery name, the estate, the money. I want to start fresh, with you. Clara's breath caught, her heart swelling with emotion. Are you sure? Ethan nodded. I've never been more sure of anything. You're my future, Clara. Not the name, not the money, just you. Clara leaned into him, her arms wrapping around his neck. Then let's do it. Together. The Montgomery estate, once bustling with activity and grandeur, now stood silent and cold. Reporters no longer swarmed the gates, but the whispers and judgments persisted in every corner of the elite circles Andrew Montgomery had once dominated. His empire was collapsing, and his influence had shrunk to a shadow of its former self. Andrew paced his study, the tension in his posture palpable. Documents detailing lawsuits and pending criminal charges were spread across his desk. His wife, Victoria, sat on the couch, staring blankly at the far wall. You should have stopped this, she said, her voice devoid of its usual sharpness. You should have controlled him. Andrew slammed his fist onto the desk, making her flinch. Don't blame this on me. That boy was weak, too soft to understand the cost of power. Victoria's gaze shifted to her husband, her eyes filled with bitterness. He understood something you never did, integrity. And now we're paying the price. Meanwhile, Clara and her family were adjusting to their new reality. Thomas Carter had found temporary work at a construction site, while Sarah picked up extra shifts at the local diner. The stress of losing their stable life at the Montgomery estate was evident, but they carried on with quiet resilience. Clara helped her mother wash dishes one evening, the warm soapy water a small comfort in the midst of their upheaval. Ethan stopped by again today, Clara said, her voice soft. Sarah glanced at her daughter, her expression thoughtful. How's he doing? He's trying, Clara said. He's carrying so much guilt over what his father did to us, to everyone. Sarah wiped her hands on a towel and placed them gently on her daughter's shoulders. You're his anchor, Clara. Just like he's yours. You'll get through this together. Clara smiled faintly, but the weight of the situation lingered in her chest. Ethan's fight to expose his father's corruption had shaken both their lives to the core, and she couldn't ignore the toll it was taking on him. Ethan had moved into a modest apartment in the city, far from the luxury he had grown up in. The sparse space was a symbol of his new beginning, free from the shadow of the Montgomery name. But the transition wasn't without its challenges. He sat at his small dining table, reviewing paperwork for a new job. The phone rang and he answered quickly, hoping it was Clara. Ethan, it's Julia, his lawyer said. I wanted to update you on the case. Your father's legal team is pushing back hard, but the evidence is solid. It's only a matter of time before the charges stick. Ethan exhaled, relief and exhaustion mixing in his voice. Thank you, Julia. I appreciate everything you've done. There's one more thing, Julia added. The media is clamoring for a statement from you. People see you as a symbol of integrity, a man who stood against his own family for what's right. Ethan's jaw tightened. I'm not interested in being a symbol. I just want to move on. I understand, Julia said. But don't underestimate the impact your actions have had. You've inspired people, Ethan. That matters. After the call ended, Ethan stared at the blank wall in front of him. He didn't feel like a hero. All he felt was the weight of everything he had lost. But then his thoughts turned to Clara, and the resolve in his chest grew stronger. She was his light, his reason to keep going. At the Carter home, Clara received an unexpected visitor. It was Victoria Montgomery, her demeanor as icy as ever. Clara opened the door cautiously, unsure of what to expect. Mrs. Montgomery, Clara said, her voice guarded. What are you doing here? Victoria stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, her heels clicking against the worn floor. She looked around, her nose wrinkling slightly at the modest surroundings. I came to talk, Victoria said, her tone clipped. About Ethan. Clara crossed her arms. What about him? Victoria's expression softened slightly, though it remained guarded. He's throwing everything away for you. His name, his future, his legacy. Are you prepared to live with that? Clara's eyes narrowed. Ethan made his choice, Mrs. Montgomery. And I won't apologize for loving him. Victoria's lips pressed into a thin line. Love isn't enough to survive in this world, Clara. Do you think you can handle the judgment, the scrutiny? Because it will never stop. Clara stepped closer, her voice firm. I don't care about their judgment. I care about Ethan. And if you really cared about him, you'd support him instead of trying to tear us apart. For a moment, Victoria said nothing. Then she turned toward the door, her composure faltering slightly. You may have his heart, Clara. But don't think for a second you'll ever have his name. Clara watched her go, the encounter leaving a bitter taste in her mouth. But as she closed the door, she reminded herself of Ethan's words. We'll face it together. Later that evening, Ethan arrived at the Carter home, his expression tired but determined. Clara greeted him with a warm hug, her arms wrapping tightly around him. Rough day? She asked gently. He nodded, resting his forehead against hers. But it's better now. They sat together in the small living room, the flickering glow of the fireplace casting soft shadows on their faces. Ethan took her hand, his voice low but steady. I talked to Julia today, he said. The case against my father is solid. It's only a matter of time before it's over. Clara squeezed his hand. And what about you? What's next for you, Ethan? He looked at her, his green eyes filled with determination. I want to build something real, Clara. Something honest. And I want to do it with you. Tears welled in her eyes, but she smiled. Then let's start now. As the night deepened, they sat together, their hands intertwined. The storm surrounding them hadn't yet passed, but for the first time in months, they felt a glimmer of hope, a future they could build together, free from the shadows of the past. The Carter family's modest home stood quiet and still as dawn broke over the town. Clara sat at the kitchen table, staring at a pile of papers that outlined the details of her family's impending move. The U.S. Marshal Service had explained the process of entering witness protection, but the reality of leaving everything behind felt heavier than she'd imagined. Her father, Thomas, walked into the kitchen, rubbing his eyes. He poured himself a cup of coffee and sat across from her. You're up early, he said softly. Clara nodded. Couldn't sleep. It's a lot to process. Thomas sipped his coffee, his expression thoughtful. We've faced worse, Clara. This is just another challenge. We'll get through it. She wanted to believe him, but the thought of saying goodbye to everything she knew, the home where she grew up, her friends, and the life she had built with Ethan, left an ache in her chest. Ethan arrived later that morning, carrying a worn duffel bag over his shoulder. His eyes were tired but resolute as he stepped inside the house. Clara met him at the door, her arms wrapping around him tightly. Are you sure about this? She whispered, her voice trembling. Ethan pulled back just enough to look into her eyes. I've never been more sure of anything. I told you, Clara, I'm with you. Wherever you go, I go. Her heart swelled with gratitude and love, though doubt still lingered in the back of her mind. But what about your life here? Your new job? Your future? You're my future, he said simply, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Everything else is just details. The farewell to their home was bittersweet. Sarah packed the last of the family photos into a small box, while Thomas loaded their belongings into the back of an unmarked van provided by the marshals. Clara lingered in her room, her fingers trailing over the edges of her favorite books and trinkets. Ethan appeared in the doorway, watching her quietly. Ready? He asked. She nodded, though the word felt hollow. I guess I have to be. As they walked out of the house for the final time, Clara turned to take one last look. The memories of her childhood, the moments of laughter and love, played through her mind like a montage. She reached for Ethan's hand and he squeezed it reassuringly. Let's go, she said, her voice steady despite the tears threatening to spill. The marshals escorted the Carter family and Ethan to a small, nondescript house in a quiet town far from their old lives. It was a stark contrast to the warmth and familiarity they had left behind, but it offered safety, something they couldn't take for granted. Clara spent the first few days unpacking and adjusting to their new surroundings. Ethan helped where he could, his presence a constant source of comfort. Despite the tension of their new reality, they found small moments of joy, shared meals, quiet walks, and long conversations about their dreams for the future. One evening, as they sat on the back porch, Ethan broke the silence. Do you regret it? Clara looked at him, surprised. Regret what? All of this, he said, gesturing to the house and the life they were now living. Giving up everything. She reached for his hand, her voice soft but firm. I didn't give up everything, Ethan. I still have you. And as long as I have that, I don't regret a thing. Ethan smiled, his heart full. You always know what to say. Clara leaned her head against his shoulder, the weight of their shared burdens momentarily lifting. We're building something new, she said. Something real. And I think that's worth everything we've lost. Back in their old town, the Montgomery name continued to unravel. Andrew's trial date had been set, and the media's coverage of his downfall was relentless. Victoria withdrew from public life, her once pristine image tarnished beyond repair. The estate, once a symbol of power and prestige, stood empty, a relic of a bygone era. Ethan's decision to testify had cemented his place as a whistleblower, but it also made him a target for those loyal to his father's empire. For Clara, the knowledge that they had escaped that world brought a sense of relief, even as she mourned the life they had left behind. As the days turned into weeks, Clara and Ethan began to find their footing in their new life. They explored the quiet town, met their new neighbors, and started to dream again. Ethan found work at a local community center, mentoring young adults, while Clara began volunteering at a nearby library. One evening, as they walked through the town's small park, Ethan stopped abruptly and turned to Clara. I've been thinking, he said. About what? She asked, her brow furrowing. About the future, he replied. This new life we're building. I want it to be official. Clara tilted her head, confused. What do you mean? Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, simple ring. Clara, I don't need a big ceremony or a fancy house. I just need you. Will you marry me? Her breath caught as tears filled her eyes. Ethan. I know this isn't the proposal you deserve, he said quickly, his voice full of emotion. But I've learned that the only thing that matters is us. So, will you? Clara smiled through her tears, nodding as she threw her arms around him. Yes, Ethan. 1,000 times yes. They stood in the quiet park, the world around them fading as they held each other. For the first time in months, the future felt bright, and the weight of the past began to lift. The morning sun streamed through the curtains of the small kitchen in their new home, casting a warm glow over the table where Clara and Ethan sat. It had been 3 months since they had started their new life together in the quiet town, and while the scars of their past still lingered, they were beginning to heal. Ethan sipped his coffee, the corners of his mouth curling into a soft smile as he watched Clara make notes in a journal. What's that? He asked. She glanced up, her eyes twinkling. Just some ideas for a community reading program at the library. I think it could be a great way to bring people together. Ethan leaned forward, resting his chin in his hand. You're amazing, you know that? Clara rolled her eyes, though a blush crept across her cheeks. It's just a small idea. It's not small, Ethan said firmly. It's you. You take everything and make it better. She reached across the table, her hand finding his. I think we make everything better. Together. Later that afternoon, Ethan visited the community center where he had begun mentoring at-risk youth. The work brought him a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. It was a far cry from the world of wealth and power he had left behind, but it was fulfilling in a way he never expected. Hey, Mr. Montgomery, a teenage boy named Jordan called out, grinning as he approached. You coming to the basketball game tomorrow? Wouldn't miss it, Ethan replied, ruffling the boy's hair. But call me Ethan, all right? No need for the formalities. Jordan laughed and ran off, leaving Ethan to marvel at how much his life had changed. For the first time he felt like he was making a real difference. No strings attached, no ulterior motives. Back at home, Clara was busy preparing dinner when the doorbell rang. She wiped her hands on a towel and opened the door to find a courier holding a small envelope. Clara Carter? The man asked. That's me, she said, accepting the envelope. She closed the door and opened it, her heart skipping a beat when she saw the sender. Julia Hayes, attorney at law. Ethan arrived home moments later, setting his bag down as he entered the kitchen. Hey, what's that? He asked, noticing the envelope in her hands. It's from Julia, Clara said, handing it to him. Ethan opened it quickly, scanning the letter inside. His expression shifted from surprise to relief. It's about the case, he said. My father has officially pled guilty to several charges. He's taking a deal to reduce his sentence. Clara exhaled, her shoulders relaxing. So it's over? Ethan nodded. It's over. The trial won't go to court. He'll serve time, but the media circus is done. We can finally move on. Clara stepped forward, wrapping her arms around him. You did it, Ethan. You stood up for what was right. We did it, he corrected, holding her tightly. I couldn't have done any of this without you. The following weekend, Ethan and Clara stood in the small town square, surrounded by neighbors and new friends. They had decided to celebrate their engagement with a simple picnic, inviting the community that had embraced them so warmly. Clara watched as Ethan laughed with Jordan and a few other kids from the community center, his genuine joy lighting up his face. She felt a swell of pride in her chest. This was the man she had always known he could be, kind, selfless, and free from the weight of his family's expectations. "Hey, future Mrs. Montgomery," Ethan said, appearing at her side with a playful grin. "Future Mr. Carter," she teased back, her eyes sparkling. Ethan laughed, pulling her into a kiss. "I like the sound of that." As the evening wound down, Ethan and Clara sat together on a blanket beneath the stars, the hum of conversation and laughter surrounding them. Ethan took her hand, his voice soft but certain. "I never thought I'd be here," he said. "Not just in this town but in this life, with you. I didn't think I deserved it." Clara looked at him, her eyes filled with love. "You do, Ethan. We both do." He nodded, squeezing her hand. "This is just the beginning, Clara. I want to build a life with you, one that's honest, real, and filled with love." She leaned her head against his shoulder, a sense of peace washing over her. "We already are." As the stars twinkled above them, Clara and Ethan felt the weight of their pasts fall away. Their journey had been fraught with challenges, but it had also been filled with moments of resilience, love, and hope. Together they had forged a new path, one that wasn't defined by the shadows of their families, but by the light they created together. What do you think about Ethan's journey? Do you believe his transformation and choices were worth the sacrifices he made? Would you have made the same decisions in his place? If this story moved you, don't forget to like and share it. Subscribe for more inspiring tales of love, resilience, and personal transformation. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you.